Hey, Brian. Good morning, everybody. And the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation will convene. And we welcome our witnesses. My colleagues, we convene this hearing, the second in our series of hearings on line-by-line review of the federal budget. Today, we'll examine how the Environmental Protection Agency has put into practice the President's repeated commitment to conduct a line-by-line review of the federal budget. The goal of this pledge is to eliminate unnecessary, duplicative, or wasteful government programs to cut costs and do more with less. This hearing aims to determine the results of EPA's efforts to cut spending and to help EPA find more spending cuts and savings for all Americans. Less than a month ago, on September 22nd, EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson testified before this subcommittee on EPA's regulatory planning, analysis, and major actions. We remain very concerned over the impact on jobs and our economy from new regulations that are issued and proposed every day by the EPA. That said, the EPA is also an important public health regulatory agency, which has contributed to the tremendous improvements in clean air, safe drinking water, environmental quality over the past 40 years. However, over the past 2 decades, the agency has become an $8 billion plus agency with about 18,000 employees around this nation. Yet with the size of the federal deficit and long-term fiscal challenges, we must ensure that EPA meets its core mission at lower cost. Indeed, Congress has a constitutionally mandated responsibility to oversee the annual budgetary process affecting agencies under their jurisdiction. We recognize that executive branch agencies are not alone in their responsibility for having created many of the programs that have given rise to our ballooning deficit. For its part, this committee must remain deeply and regularly engaged with the agency within its jurisdiction, including EPA, as they define their priorities, identify their needs, and set their goals for the years ahead. Today, we look at the actual results of the EPA's effort thus far to meet the President's pledge to comb through the federal budget line by line, cutting spending. We are aware of several initiatives related to that worthy goal, but what measurable results have been achieved? For example, the committee has learned from O&B document that EPA responded to the President's April 2009 instruction to Cabinet members to identify, within 90 days, at least $100 million in aggregate cuts to their administrative budgets by proposing the, quote, energy-efficient lighting project, end quote. That is, changing light bulbs in EPA's office buildings. EPA anticipated annual savings of that pilot project to be de minimis, although it claims the initiative could lead to savings over the long run. Now, while EPA claims to have eliminated additional cost-saving efforts since that time, they did not provide to the committee the specifics on what actions were taken or indeed how much money they actually saved. To learn more about EPA's efforts, we'll take testimony today from the Inspector General of EPA, Arthur Elkins, and the Director of Natural Resources and Environment at GAO, David Trimble. These individuals and their staffs have conducted rigorous oversight and audits of EPA for many years. The GAO and the EPA Inspector General have frequently identified areas where EPA can improve its internal controls, its management, and its performance measures, all to cut costs or get more bang for the buck. Their reports address concerns about how effectively and wisely EPA uses its resources to meet its mission. Their work, as we will hear this morning, identifies problems and recommends improvements in EPA's reporting of spending, such as the money it obligates through grants, and EPA's ability to track whether its employees are being used effectively to meet its core mission, and even in EPA's knowledge about duplicative and unnecessary facilities around this country. As we will hear, there is still much room for improvement. For example, the EPA's budget justification documents do not describe the amount of potentially millions of dollars of unspent money known as deobligated and recertified funding is available for new obligation. We say the word million, but it's actually billions. Such information could be useful to Congress because of the availability of recertified amounts that could partially offset the need for new funding. So my colleagues today intend to inquire of them as to what the EPA has done thus far and what remains to be done. For that reason, the subcommittee also welcomes Barbara Bennett, the Chief Financial Officer of EPA. We hope that she will be able to address the substance of the Inspector General's and GAO's outstanding concerns. The subcommittee and the committee as a whole is committed to working with the EPA to ensure that it has the tools it needs to realize these aims and ensure that it is a trustworthy custodian of hard-earned American taxpayers. Today's hearing can be a good start to help us deal more effectively with the enormous challenge of getting federal spending under control. I look forward to revisiting this subject with EPA next year following submission of the President's budget. With that, my opening statement is done, and I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Gett, for allowing me to go first on this opening statement. Today we're looking at EPA's budget. It's a lean one for an agency with so many crucial responsibilities, although I think if the Republicans get their way, there'll be no reason for the agency because we'll have no environmental laws anymore. In February of this year, the President submitted his proposed budget for fiscal year 2012, requesting $8.9 billion for EPA. That's a 13% decrease over the fiscal year 2010 enacted levels. The President had to make some hard choices in this budget. The President proposed cutting almost $1 billion from the Clean Water and Drinking Water state revolving funds, which help states improve municipal wastewater and drinking water systems. He proposed cutting $125 million from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and $70 million from the Superfund Toxic Waste Cleanup Program. The administration also targeted several categories of administrative spending at EPA to achieve $40 million in additional savings. Now, some of these cuts are excessive. The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund should be getting an increase because it makes investments in infrastructure that create jobs. Thus, the notion that EPA is not sacrificing its fair share is false. Despite these painful cuts, EPA has set ambitious goals for this fiscal year, taking action on climate change. Well, some people don't think they ought to do that. Improving air quality, well, a lot of members don't seem to think that's a good idea. Protecting American waters, well, the American people believe in that, but a lot of Republicans don't. Ensuring the safety of chemicals, Preventing pollution, enforcing America's environmental laws. Those are still the law, and they'll continue to be the law, and therefore EPA has a responsibility to enforce them, and the American people support that. These are important objectives that benefit every American in every state across the country. Americans know that their families' health and quality of life depend on a clean environment. They know we need a strong EPA to stop polluters from poisoning our land, our air, and our water. Today we'll hear from EPA that EPA should be doing more to squeeze out extra savings. While I'm sure EPA could find additional reductions and efficiencies along the margins, I'm equally sure that the bill that still won't be enough for my Republican colleagues. Their goal is not a careful line-by-line review of the budget. Their goal is to prevent EPA from requiring dirty power plants, chemical plants, oil refineries, and other large industrial sources to stop polluting the air with toxic mercury and other dangerous emissions. That's what we've been fighting on the floor about the last several weeks. Republicans' approach to EPA's budget is less about targeted reductions and more about slash-and-burn politics. The Republican budgets we have seen this year are the most sweeping and reckless assault on health and the environment that we've seen in decades. The fiscal year 2012 Interior Appropriations bill that stalled in the House late this summer would slash EPA's budget to $7.1 billion, which is 20% less than the President requested. This would deny the agency the resources it needs to carry out the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and other critical public health protections. But that's not all. Every week we consider another bill on the House floor that stops EPA from doing its job to protect our environment. In fact, the House has voted 83 times this year to undermine the EPA. In total, the House has voted 159 times to undermine environmental protections. If the Republicans had their way, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act would be gutted, and the EPA would be rendered powerless to keep our air clean enough to breathe, and our clean enough to breathe, and our water safe enough to drink. I'm glad we have EPA's Chief Financial Officer here today, and I look forward to her testimony. She'll be able to tell us what the impact of the Republicans' approach to EPA budget would be on her agency and for public health and the environment. It's not a budget that's good for our environment, our health, or American families. And that's my comment on this hearing and the Republican agenda. And because I have 20 seconds and I use my time frugally, I yield that back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Former Chairman Waxman and I live in different worlds. We're here to talk about EPA's budget. That's the legitimate role of this subcommittee. We have a balance sheet that's been prepared. It shows their total liabilities and assets are about $23 billion. Between fiscal year 2009 and 2010, it shows a decrease of about $1 billion, which would be about 4%. That's not draconian. My good friend from California would have you believe that we want to eliminate the Environmental Protection Agency and eliminate all environmental laws. Nothing's further from the truth. You know, I have voted for all the major environmental laws since I've been in Congress, and I've voted to pass budgets to implement them and to enforce them. I have a sister who's an enforcement attorney at EPA in Dallas with a close to 100% success rate in enforcing laws that some people try to get around. You know, what we have a debate about, Mr. Chairman, is an EPA under the Obama administration that seems interested in pushing everything to the limit, that seems interested in issuing regulations that really don't have a sound basis in science or in fact, that seem to be more for political purposes than they do for environmental protection purposes. My good friend from California apparently doesn't believe that any of the laws that he and I have worked together to pass in the last almost 30 years have had any impact at all, and that the only thing that is protecting the American people is pending additional EPA regulation. Mr. Chairman, in my opinion, nothing could be further from the truth. And what Republicans in this Congress are attempting to do is actually shine the light of transparency on what's really happening at the EPA, where the money is going, and perhaps, just perhaps, how it could be better spent. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Gentleman yields his 2 minutes. The gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn's recognized for two minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've come to believe that this administration's view of the economy can be summed up succinctly: if it moves, tax it; if it keeps moving, regulate it; if it stops moving, subsidize it. And those are timeless words from former President Reagan, and they couldn't be more appropriate today as we look at the tsunami of government spending and regulations, and much of that is coming from the EPA. Many of the complaints we hear in our district are about the way EPA handles their rules, regulations, and spending. And today I hope that we can get kind of uncover what Administrator Jackson has done to truly reform the budget process in the line by line. I had a quote she gave in February 27th of 2009. It was in an interview, and she stated, and I'm quoting, "As far as I understand the budget process, I can't tell you what EPA's budget will be from year to year," end quote. That one concerned me. I read it a few times and looked at it, and with that statement, I think that she clearly laid out why we need to practice appropriate oversight, why we need to go through this budget line by line to look for an opportunity to help EPA provide a level of certainty, reduce waste, and force the agency to set priorities. And so I thank all of our witnesses who are with us today. As you all are aware, we have another hearing, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman, Mr. Sullivan, is recognized for 1 minute.
Chairman Stearns, thank you for holding this important hearing today on cutting the EPA spending. In September 2009, the Obama administration announced plans to implement a line-by-line, page-by-page review of the federal budget, and he tasked his cabinet with members to find savings. Here we are 2 years later, and the President has still not done what he promised with the budget. The simple fact is the federal government is broke, and we are in a fiscal crisis. We must make extraordinary efforts to cut spending, eliminate waste, and find savings, which is why this oversight hearing is so important. EPA has cut some spending as part of a routine annual budget and appropriations process, but has not taken any real extraordinary steps to cut spending. We know that EPA has upwards of $13.3 billion in unexpended appropriations, and both the GAO and the Inspector General say that EPA lacks basic internal controls and data on employee workloads and how it spends on its payroll. Thanks in advance to our panel before us, and it's my hope that our discussion here today sheds light on the EPA's budget situation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chairman recognizes the ranking member, gentlelady from Colorado, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me. This is the second in a hearing that the subcommittee launched last week about the administration's budget review process. When I went home to my district over the weekend, I was telling people about the hearing last week, and they really couldn't believe it because it was really one of the with all due respect, it was one of the silliest hearings that I've seen in my 15 years in Congress. It started out with the majority playing a video of the president promising little clips showing him promising a line-by-line budget review, which then I thought maybe that was figurative, but in fact, literally then, members of this subcommittee spent the whole time talking about, did the president actually personally review the budget line by line? I don't think that's really what we need to be looking at, and I would hope the majority doesn't think so either, because what we really need to look at is the budget process of these various agencies and whether or not they've conducted an efficient and effective budget review and whether improvements can be made in this process. I think that that is an important oversight responsibility for this subcommittee for every agency, not just the EPA. And so I think that those are important questions that should be asked of all of these witnesses. And so to that end, let's look at a few key facts about the EPA budget review process as I understand it. Right here is this large notebook, what's known as the Agency Budget Justifications, which the EPA prepares and provides to the appropriations committees each year. This mammoth set of documents reflects the detailed process in which the EPA engages to produce a budget proposal. In this document, the agency provides a detailed explanation of the funding levels requested for each EPA program area. The EPA justifications document results from a multi-step review process, as I understand it, in which the EPA program staff develop a budget proposal, the EPA chief financial officer reviews the proposal, EPA senior leadership meets to discuss overall funding level requests, EPA submits a proposal to OMB, EPA negotiates with OMB over the proposal, and OMB sends back an approved budget. And as in previous years of the Obama administration, the review process at the EPA has resulted in an administration budget proposal for the EPA that requests increases in funding for some programs and decreases fundings for other. And that's as it should be. And I would assume that that involves a line-by-line review of these budget requests by the people in the agency who are responsible for those parts of those budget. But you can understand our concern about cuts to the EPA budget, because if you just look and see what Congress has already voted to do, we're not just talking about should we have new regulations. In H.R. 1 and in other votes in this Congress, we have seen substantial cuts to enforcement for existing environmental review programs. In fact, they're some of the most anti-environmental votes that I have seen. In the first 10 months of this Congress, we've had 159 floor votes to undermine protection of the environment, EPA programs to reduce toxic mercury pollution, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and make our nation's vehicles more efficient and reduce gas costs for consumers. And on and on. I've asked the Democratic staff to prepare a list of the existing EPA agencies and regulations, which Mr. Barton and others say they support, which have had drastic proposals, slashed budgets for enforcement in previous votes of this Congress, which I don't think are probably borne out by the evidence. And so here's the thing. I think that the public values clean water and clean air. I think they value strong environmental enforcement. And furthermore, I think these environmental laws produce health, economic, and environmental benefits that actually increase our budget. In fact, some estimates have shown $1.3 trillion in 2010. By 2020, the benefits are projected to reach $2 trillion annually, outweighing estimated costs by more than 30 to 1. Overall, in the 3-decade period from 1990 to 2020, the Clean Air Act is estimated to deliver $12 trillion worth of benefits, plus a host of additional health and welfare benefits that cannot be monetized. And so if you look at the EPA spending compared to the enormous impact on public health, EPA's proposed 2012 budget is just 0.06% of the federal government's total debt, 0.26% of total spending, and 0.69% of the federal deficit. If you eliminated the EPA altogether, it wouldn't even be a blip in our nation's budget. But the cost that we would pay in health and in other types of spending would be astronomical. I think we need to have savings in the EPA just like every other agency, but I think that this fixation we have is wrong and we've got to stop it.
Gentlelady completes her opening statement, and let me introduce our witnesses before we put them under oath. We have the Honorable Barbara J. Bennett, Chief Financial Officer, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The Honorable Arthur A. Elkins, Jr., Inspector General, who's accompanied by Melissa Heist, Assistant Inspector General for Audit, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And we have Mr. David C. Trimble, Director, National Resources and Environment, U.S. Government Accounting Office. Welcome to you folks. You folks are aware that the committee is holding an investigative hearing, and when doing so has had the practice of taking testimony under oath. Do you have any objection to testifying under oath? No. The chair then advises you that under the rules of the House and rules of the committee, you are entitled to be advised by counsel. Do you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? No? In that case, you please rise and raise your right hand. I will swear you in. Do you swear that the testimony that you're about to give is the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You are now under oath and subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. You may now each give a 5-minute summary of your written statement. Ms. Bennett, you shall start, and just turn your mic on.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Stearns, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to be here to discuss with you the important issue of ensuring the most effective and efficient use of taxpayer dollars. As you mentioned in your letter to Administrator Jackson, President Obama has stated several times his intent that his administration would review the federal budget page by page, line by line, and eliminating those programs we don't need and insisting that those we do operate in a sensible and cost-effective way. While we have always worked diligently with regard to our budget formulation process at EPA, the President's directive has given us an opportunity to look even more closely at our budget process to ensure that we are achieving maximum efficiencies. To address how we have in fact been pursuing this close scrutiny of our budget, I would like to take a moment to discuss EPA's budget over the last decade or so. Apart from the targeted increases to the state revolving funds and for programs funded under the Recovery Act of 2009, EPA's budget has not grown significantly over the last decade. Even including the increase to the SRFs in fiscal year 2010, between fiscal year 2000 and the fiscal year 2012 President's budget request, the agency has experienced a compound annual growth rate of just 1.4%, a rate less than that of inflation. During this 10-year time frame, our responsibilities have grown, as did our costs for such necessities as rent, utilities, security, and payroll. For more than a decade, we at EPA have needed to make cuts to existing programs to find resources to fund emerging priorities. The work of the agency is reviewed at the appropriation, program project, and where established, the sub-program project levels. This is the budget structure developed in concert with OMB and with Congress. Within this framework, the agency considers the progress made towards its annual and long-term goals and priorities as articulated in our strategic plan and emerging needs. Meeting existing commitments and planning for future needs cannot be done without considering opportunities to redirect resources to higher priorities and reduce overall budget levels as required. In making these reductions, we have carefully considered guidance from the administration and Congress by looking first to less effective, potentially overlapping activities for reductions or eliminations. However, the need to find reductions and fund higher priorities also means that at times worthy projects get cut. During this administration, we have had to make some difficult decisions to eliminate or reduce programs. In our fiscal year 2010 budget request, we included a $10 million cut to the U.S.-Mexico border program. In fiscal year 2011, we proposed over $30 million in reductions to Homeland Security programs. We also reduced our travel budget by nearly 40% over the prior year. In fiscal year 2012, in our request, we've included a reduction of over $6 million from indoor air and radiation programs, as well as approximately $10 million in efficiencies in our agency-wide IT programs. Over the past several years, we've also had success in finding efficiencies that enable us to maximize the resources available to core programs. Some examples include efforts to find savings in rent and utilities through space consolidation. Between fiscal year 2006 and 2011, we've released approximately 375,000 square feet of space at headquarters and facilities nationwide, resulting in cumulative annual rent avoidance of over $12 million. These are just a few examples of some of the choices we have made and efficiencies we have achieved as we reviewed our programs in developing EPA's budgets to ensure wise use of resource dollars and as we seek to do our part to reduce the deficit while maintaining effective protections for human health and the environment. Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank you again for inviting me to testify about the agency's effort to apply close scrutiny to our budget. And I hope I have conveyed to you the seriousness with which we at EPA take our responsibility to ensure that all funds are used prudently so that we can continue to effectively fulfill our mission of protecting human health and the environment, especially during these times of tight fiscal constraint. And with that, I look forward to responding to your questions.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Elkins, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Stearns, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee. I am Arthur Elkins, Jr., Inspector General of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I also serve as the Inspector General of the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board. I am accompanied by Melissa Heiss, Assistant Inspector General for Audit. I am pleased to appear before you today to discuss recent work we've done that identifies opportunities for cost savings and greater efficiencies within the agency. I submitted a statement for the record which details this work. This morning, I want to focus my remarks on two areas: management of the agency's human capital and EPA facilities. Over the last 5 years, EPA has averaged a little over 18,000 positions with annual payroll cost of approximately $2 billion. For an organization to operate efficiently and effectively, it must know what its workload is. The main objectives of assessing and predicting workload are to achieve an evenly distributed, manageable workload and to accurately determine the resource levels needed to carry out the work. We have issued 3 reports since 2010 examining how the agency manages its workload and workforce levels. We found that it has not collected comprehensive workload data or conducted workload analysis across EPA in about 20 years. The agency does not require program officers to collect and maintain workload data. Without sufficient workload data, program officers are limited in their ability to analyze their workloads and accurately estimate resource needs. Therefore, the agency must base budget decisions primarily on subjective justifications at a time when budgets continue to tighten and data-driven decisions are needed. We also found that the agency's policies and procedures do not include a process for determining resource levels based on workload as prescribed by OMB. As a result, the agency cannot demonstrate that it has the right number of resources to accomplish its mission. Finally, we found that the agency does not have a coherent program of position management to assure the efficient and effective use of its workforce. Position management provides the operational link between human capital goals and the placement of qualified individuals into authorized positions. Without an agency-wide position management program, EPA leadership lacks reasonable assurance that it is using personnel in an effective and efficient manner to achieve mission results. We made several recommendations to address these findings. While the agency has taken action to study workforce issues and update their budget guidance, most of our recommendations remain unresolved and resolution efforts are in progress. Regarding EPA space and facilities, in fiscal year 2009, we collected data on staffing levels and total costs for EPA facilities in response to a request from the House Appropriations Committee. Based on EPA data, we reported at the time that EPA had more than 18,000 employees in 140 locations across the country. These locations cost approximately $300 million annually, which included rent or leases, utilities, and security costs. EPA headquarters accounted for $100 million, the largest portion of those costs. We also reported that EPA had 86 locations with 5 or fewer employees at a cost of $2.25 million. Many of these offices were actually staffed by only 1 or 2 people. We made no recommendations because the request was limited to data collection. However, we do believe EPA should examine its real estate portfolio for possible cost savings. Facilities data like we collected would assist EPA in determining whether it should shrink its footprint either through consolidating or eliminating facilities. We will soon begin a project this fiscal year that will assess EPA facility occupancy to determine whether EPA is maintaining optimal utilization of existing space in its location and whether opportunities exist to reduce facility costs, which will also assist EPA in its decision-making. In closing, EPA must find ways to better manage and utilize its resources and improve its operational efficiencies in this tight budget environment. I believe the OIG has added value by making numerous specific recommendations to the agency over the years to help address these issues, many of which it has agreed to implement. Going forward, the agency will need to intensify its efforts to control the cost of and maximize the benefits from the resources entrusted to it. We will continue to work with the agency to further identify areas needing attention. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I would be pleased to answer any questions the subcommittee may have.
Mr. Trimble, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Stearns, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to be here today to discuss GAO's work on management challenges facing EPA, as well as observations on the agency's budget. As you know, EPA operates in a highly complex and controversial regulatory arena, and its policies and programs affect virtually all segments of the economy, society, and the government. My testimony draws on prior GAO work and focuses on 3 areas: management of EPA's workload, workforce, and real property, coordination with other agencies to more effectively leverage limited resources, and observations on the agency's annual requests for new budget authority. First, in 2010, we reported that EPA had not comprehensively analyzed its workload and workforce since the 1980s to determine the optimal numbers and distribution of staff across the agency. Rather than establishing a process for budgeting and allocating human resources based on the agency's workload, EPA requested funding and staffing through incremental adjustments based on historical precedent. We recommended that EPA link its workforce plan to its strategic plan and establish mechanisms to monitor and evaluate its workforce planning efforts. Such efforts could enhance the agency's ability to strategically allocate scarce resources. Earlier this year, GAO reported on challenges that EPA faces in managing its laboratories, both from a workforce and a real property perspective. We reported that EPA operated a laboratory system comprised of 37 labs, housed in 170 buildings and facilities in 30 cities across the nation. We reported that EPA's laboratory activities were managed by 15 different senior managers, were largely uncoordinated, and that the agency did not have a comprehensive process for managing its laboratory workforce. For example, EPA did not have basic information on its laboratory workload or workforce, such as data on the number of federal and contract employees working in its labs. This report also identified challenges related to the agency's management of its real property, a government-wide challenge that is part of GAO's high-risk series. In 2010, the administration directed agencies to speed up efforts to identify and eliminate excess properties to help achieve $3 billion in cost savings by 2012. In July 2010, EPA told the Office of Management and Budget that it did not anticipate disposing of any of its laboratories in the near future because the facilities were fully used and considered critical to the agency. However, we found that EPA did not have accurate and reliable information called for by OMB on the need for the facilities, the property use, facility condition, and facility operating efficiency to inform its determination. Second, the nature of EPA's work requires it to coordinate and collaborate with other federal agencies as well as state, local, and tribal partners. Our recent work on the Chesapeake Bay cleanup in pharmaceuticals and drinking water has shown that EPA could do a better job collaborating with these partners and, in turn, better leverage limited resources. In 2009, we reported that the efforts of EPA and 6 federal agencies to support drinking water and wastewater projects in the U.S.-Mexico border region were ineffective because only one of the agencies involved had comprehensively assessed the region's needs or had coordinated policies for selecting and building projects. We included this issue in our March 2011 report to Congress concerning federal programs with duplicative goals or activities. Third and finally, with respect to the agency's budget and annual request for budget authority, our past reviews of the agency's budget justification documents have led to 2 recurring observations. First, regarding proposals for new or expanded funding, the agency has not consistently provided clear justification for the funds requested or what steps the agency would take to ensure the effective use of the funding. Second, over the years, we have focused on the agency's efforts to make use of unliquidated balances or funds that were appropriated and obligated but never actually spent. This occurs when contracts, grants, or interagency agreements expire with some level of funding remaining unspent. We have encouraged EPA to quickly identify and recover these funds for other uses as it could decrease the need for new budget authority. While EPA has made progress in recovering these funds, we have observed that EPA does not include this information in its budget justification documents. We believe that information on the reuse of such funds could help Congress in its budget deliberations. This concludes my prepared statement. I would be pleased to answer any questions that you or other members of the subcommittee may have.
Mr. Trimble, thank you very much, and I'll start with my questions. Ms. Bennett, you heard Mr. Trimble from the GAO. Were you aware of his report? Yes or no?
I'm aware of most of the reports, yes.
Okay. And has your staff been working on answers to some of those items he talked about, and particularly the one dealing with unexpended appropriations?
Yes, in fact, we have been working hard on most of what are called the unliquidated obligations.
Okay. You said in your opening statement, you also said in your prepared statement that the President had a directive to you to look at item by item, line by line in the budget. So just to be clear, the President asked you to review the budget page by page, line by line. Was this a directive that you understood?
This is a directive that we have heard from the President and by OMB. We have heard that, although there hasn't been an explicit order or explicit guidance, but I am familiar with that, obviously, from what...
So you have no written document from anybody on what this means to you?
Well, I have a very good understanding of what line by line and page by page means in terms of...
Would you say that it was a figure of speech, or did it actually mean the President actually said line by line, item by item, page by page, program by program? He was pretty specific. Do you understand that to be literal, or you think that's a figure of speech?
Well, I wouldn't suppose what the President says, but I certainly took it to heart in terms of how we approached it.
Would I be fair to say that you've taken it at its literal meaning?
Well, what we have done is we've had a process that goes through...
So you've actually, procedure-wise, have gone item by item, line by line, and page by page, program by program.
Through the programs and looks at all of our programs in terms of the program project level and what we have identified and worked with both OMB
Could I
and
construe that to mean that you're actually looking at every page and every line and every item as a
in
program?
terms of the agency is concerned,
That's true, huh?
we have staff that, that goes through all aspects of the budget and is able to identify programs and the like. So we have worked, as I mentioned it, that we have, we've worked with both OMB and with Congress on what we have
You couldn't
submitted.
do that by just going in a broad sense. You'd have to get into a detailed sense. So your prepared statement and your opening statement has confirmed in my mind that you didn't consider this a figure of speech, but you considered it something that you had to get into the details and follow the directive from the president. So maybe EPA's look at financial records, such as the ledger sheet that I mentioned earlier, page 26 from the EPA Inspector General's report on financial statements. If you, and I want to give a copy to Ms. Bennett. Does the staff give a copy?
I've got it.
Okay. If you look at the highlighted line for unexpended appropriations, it says $3.3 billion. Do you see that one? It's in the bottom there?
I do.
Okay. Now, EPA's budget is around $8 billion. So to see unexpected money that's not obligated, that is just sitting there at that amount of money, almost twice, not quite twice, of your overall budget, to us, obviously, it's a very large number. So what does that $13.3 billion in unexpended appropriations mean in this document that I show you?
Mr. Stearns, Mr. Chairman, this is a balance sheet from 2010 and as compared to 2009. And in 2010, EPA's budget was $10.3 billion, as well as had received over $7 billion in Recovery Act funding. And so the combination of those two, of $17 billion that would have come through in 2009 and 2010 would be reflective here, not the $8 billion that you referenced for this year.
So you're saying that you got so much money that you couldn't spend it all?
No, that's not what I say at all. What I'm saying is that it's not reflective of the $8 billion that you mentioned.
Well, the $8 billion is your annual budget.
It's, for 2010, we're at just over 8.7.
Okay, so when I look and you got this budget, but you're still not explaining to me how you could have $13.3 billion of funds that have not been spent. Where does this money, is it money that is in a bank account, money that you can get from the Treasury? What's this money doing? Why can't you just give it back to the Treasury and reduce the deficit?
Well, actually, most of our funds go to the states and tribal assistance grants, and many of those projects are multi-year in
So you're saying this is all, 13.3 is obligated funds that you haven't spent yet?
There, most of the funds have been obligated and have not been spent. These
How do
are
you know that?
unliquidated.
Do you have a report that you could give us to show how that 13.3 billion is detailed in obligations to Indian tribes, to who else?
States.
States,
Yeah,
okay.
States and communities, and for water infrastructure.
I mean, is it obligated from 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 90 days?
Well, it's, a lot of them are all obligations, so some of them.
Over what period of time?
Well, this is a balance sheet, which reflects cumulative.
Could it be more than 5 years?
Well, at the particular time of this balance sheet, it could have been, yes.
Could it be more
For
than 10 years?
For instance, in 2011, the budget that we received that is encompasses the $8.7 billion that I referred to, called for rescission of unobligated.
Okay, I understand. I'm going to close. I just asked Mr. Trimble, do you understand what she's saying?
Yeah, I believe so. There's always a lag time between when money is appropriated and obligated and actually spent. So there's a lag through this process. But we've not looked, or I've not had a chance to look over the balance sheet.
Okay, I'll close. Ms. Trimble, I think Ms. Bennett, for the record, we'd like to get where this obligated funds is in a time, duration, milestone, so we can see if its money can be returned to the Treasury or that actually you have obligations. So with that, my questions are complete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to this balance sheet, a balance sheet is a snapshot in time as of, in this case, the end of the fiscal year for 2010 and 2009, correct, Ms. Bennett?
Yes, that's correct.
And so I think we're mixing apples and oranges a little bit, because as of September 30th of each of those years, you've got unexpended appropriations there on that balance sheet. But what you're saying is that's most of that, it's not just money that's sitting there from an appropriation that could be given back. It's obligated for something, correct?
That is correct.
And so what Mr. Stearns and I would like you to do is to go back and for each of those fiscal years to make a breakdown of that, how much of that was obligated and where it was obligated, and for each of those programs, how many, because it's not the same for every program. It's a different time period for which those funds are obligated, correct?
Right, correct. Some programs spend the funds faster. For instance, the
Right.
water infrastructure projects take
So if you
longer.
could just supplement your testimony with that information, I think that would help us to figure out exactly what that number means in terms of funds.
We'll be happy to get back.
Thank you very much. Now, my second question to you is, there have been some suggestions made by both of the other agencies represented here today. Have you reviewed those recommendations?
Just about all of them.
Okay. Now, one recommendation that both the IG and the GAO had made was that the EPA review its personnel policies and its management policies to make sure that the human resources are actually working to achieve the agency's mission. I hate to put words into your mouths, but that's essentially it. Have you reviewed those types of recommendations?
Yes, and I've spoken with both the Inspector General.
And what is the EPA doing to address those recommendations?
So the workforce and the workload issues are two separate issues. Although
Okay.
they sound very similar, they're actually different issues. The workload is the amount of work that the agency has to do, and the workforce
Right.
reflects more like skills that are
Right.
needed and might be needed in the future. And so what my office has done have led the workload planning. And so we have taken into consideration the recommendations from both the Inspector General and from GAO, and my office is leading an analysis that is really three-pronged in nature. One is benchmarking line managers in terms of...
Okay, if you could just shorten up a little, because
Sure.
I've got a lot more questions and not much time left.
Sure, we're taking a look to see where we can address the recommendations.
And when are you going to be finished with that review, so that you can, and having made your own internal recommendations?
Yeah, we're finished with one part of it, and we should be finished with the second step sometime shortly.
If you can provide the committee with that information, that would be helpful as well.
We'll be
Now, Mr. Elkins, you made a number of observations and recommendations. These issues have been systemic in the EPA for some number of years, correct?
That is correct.
These didn't just rise up in the past couple of years, right?
Based on our
How-
findings, that's correct.
Based on your findings, how long have these issues been present in the EPA?
Well, we've looked at this issue at least over the last, 3 to 4 years or so?
Okay, so the last 3 or 4 years. And you're working with Ms. Bennett and her staff to try to address those recommendations?
That is correct.
Okay, and do you believe that they're going to address them?
We have been told that they are actively seeking to address them, that's correct.
Okay. And Mr. Trimble, what about you? The issues that you identified in your excellent report, how long have they been going on in the EPA?
Well, in regards to the workforce planning, I believe we note that the last time comprehensive plan was done was the 1980s.
So it's over 20 years that this has been going on.
That's correct.
And and what about the other issues?
Workload is probably also a longstanding issue that crops up also when we do more programmatic focused work as well.
And what about the facilities issues? I thought that was an interesting issue and one that I think would take time to address.
Well, facilities is a little bit different in that GAO has put government-wide facility management, federal real property management on its high-risk list, so government-wide issue in that regard.
And how long has it been, how long has
That, I believe, is 2003, 2004, that
Okay.
timeframe.
Okay.
And the issue I cite in the report just came out of work we did this year concerning the laboratory.
Now, has GAO been working with EPA to address the GAO recommendations?
We've made recommendations, we've discussed those. I know in regards to workforce, they have a contractor has just completed a study. Booz Allen, I believe, is just finishing a study. We've not looked at the scope or sort of, the findings of that work.
Do you
as yet.
intend to do that?
I imagine we will end up having follow-on work, but nothing's planned at this point.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Texas recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bennett, how many employees are currently employed at EPA?
We requested in the 2012 budget just over 17,200.
17,200. You mentioned in your prepared testimony that the travel budget was reduced by 40% last year. Is that correct?
Close to it, yes.
Okay. Do you know how much was actually spent on travel last year?
In 2011, I don't off the top of my head and be happy to get
Do you
back
know
to
how much was, well,
I do know what we did with the budget.
well, you said that you reduced it, it was reduced 40%. So what, 40% from what?
It had, in 2010, we had a budget of approximately $60 million. And so we had reduced it to less than 50, and then we have it reduced again to less than $40 million.
So that's in your budget. You don't know what was actually spent, but you've gone from 60 million to 40 million.
We took a significant cut in 2011.
Okay. Do you know what that would be per employee?
I haven't done the math on a per employee.
Okay.
Not everybody travels.
Just roughly, that would be either $2,000 or $20,000. It's either $2,000 or $20,000 an employee. That's just back of the envelope numbers. Do you know how many employees at EPA of these 17,000 have an EPA credit card?
Have a credit card, an EPA credit card?
Yeah.
I don't know the number of how many have
You have
got
an
an
estimate?
individual. I'd have to get back to you on that.
Okay, Mr. Elkins, do you happen to know that number?
No, I don't.
Okay. Could you, each of you attempt to get that number and the number of employees that have EPA credit cards and the credit limit on those credit cards and the amount spent on those credit cards in the most recent fiscal year? Can y'all do that?
Be glad to.
Be glad to get back to
Do
you.
you happen to know, either one of you, whether EPA has ever done an audit of the EPA employees that have credit cards?
I know that we have a process in place within the Office of the Chief Financial Officer that makes sure that those travel vouchers are looked at and reviewed for appropriateness.
Okay. Ms. Heist, you looked like you wanted to say something.
Thank you, sir. We have done some work. We have not, to this date, identified.
Pull the microphone close to you.
Oh. We've done some minimal work in that area. We haven't found significant problems. We've looked at all the controls in place, and we found them to be generally working well.
Well, when I was subcommittee chairman of this subcommittee, we did an audit of the FDA and the number of employees that had credit cards. And we found out that there were thousands. And we found out that there were no real controls. And we found out that one FDA employee purchased a Ford Mustang on an FDA credit card. And so it might be worthy of some investigation, because people being people, my guess is that lots of folks at EPA have credit cards, and not all, but some of them probably abuse them. Ms. Bennett, are you aware of a Title 42 program at EPA?
I am aware of the program.
Do you support that program?
We have used the program for our highly trained and highly skilled scientists that we have primarily in our Office of Research and Development.
Are you aware that the EPA union for the Washington region is opposing that program?
I am not aware of that.
They are. Do you know what the compliance budget is at EPA
The overall,
for enforcement of existing regulations?
I can certainly access it, sure.
Do you just, either you or Mr. Elkins give us a ballpark figure what the compliance or enforcement budget is? I mean, after all, that's where the rubber really meets the road in terms of protecting the environment. We know what the general budget is. Do you know, either one of you, what the compliance budget or enforcement budget is?
The Office of Enforcement and Compliance has a budget of over $600 million.
$600 million. Is that up or down from the last year?
It is slightly up.
Slightly up.
Mm-hmm.
In spite of all these mean-spirited Republicans who want to, according to my friends on the Democratic side, gut the EPA, the real heart of the EPA, enforcement and compliance, is up. Is that right?
We've proposed it to have an increase largely due to an initiative that we were redirecting funds towards in order to transition from paper reporting to electronic reporting in order to reduce burdens.
Okay. Well, thank you for an honest answer. My last question, and I know my time's expired. I would like, for the record, Mrs. Bennett to provide the number of enforcement actions that EPA has initiated in the last several years and the percentage of those enforcement actions that have resulted in fines being collected or criminal sentences being applied.
I'd be happy to follow up with you.
And if the Inspector General has information, we'd like for you to provide that also.
Be happy to.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, gentlemen. The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I ask my question, I just wanted to say I can see that from Ms. Bennett's testimony that despite everything, EPA is making a good attempt to respond to the recommendations and are in the process of addressing issues that have been around for a very long time. And I really think you could probably do more of that if we didn't keep calling EPA up to the hill every day and asking for report after report. I realize we have to do oversight, but I think we're overdoing it a bit. My questions are around the cuts to the EPA budget. The President has proposed a budget for EPA for 2012 that's $8.97 billion, and it sounds like a lot of money, but when you put it in perspective, it's really just 0.06% of the total government debt, 0.26% of total government spending, and 0.69% of the budget deficit. So we could really close down EPA and shutter the building and not make a dent in our overall budget deficit, but the ramifications for public health and the environment would be truly profound. This summer, the House Appropriators proposed cutting EPA's budget by 20% below what the President requested for 2012. And the President's request was low to begin with because it was already 13% below 2010 levels. Ms. Bennett, could you describe what impact these proposed Republican budget cuts would have on EPA's ability to implement and enforce the Clean Air Act?
Certainly that level of cut would make things very difficult, and in terms of our overall responsibilities, not just the Clean Air Act, but overall responsibilities. In particular, there's a proposal of another $1 billion cut to the SRF budget, as well as another, I believe, $100 million to state categorical grants, and over another $100 million to the Great Lakes Initiative. So there would be significant impact from that level of cut, and that budget would be lower than what we saw in 1998.
Wow. So you might not be able to, you might have to reduce air quality monitoring also, and might not be able to update your air quality standards in a timely manner. Would it
We would certainly have to look at what we would have to be able to discontinue or what we would be able to afford at that time.
And what impact would these proposed budget cuts have on EPA's ability to implement and enforce the Safe Drinking Water Act?
Well, again, as I believe that the proposal is would be to reduce the SRFs by combined $1 billion, and therefore it would be reduced dramatically if it were on a pro rata basis.
I want to note that the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund helps utilities deal with costs of meeting drinking water standards and repairing and replacing aging infrastructure, much of which is approaching the end of their useful life. The U.S. Conference of Mayors estimates that this spending is an economic win-win because it creates jobs and spurs the economy while ensuring healthy drinking water. These budget cuts would also affect the pace of toxic waste cleanups in communities across the country. So, Ms. Bennett, could you describe what impact these proposed budget cuts would have on EPA's ability to clean up the nation's worst toxic waste sites?
There would be, again, as I understand how, what has been proposed on that particular bill, is there would be an additional cut to Superfund. And there would be additional cuts to other areas, making it very difficult to continue the work that's been done.
And, since it has been reported that maybe around 60% of some of these toxic waste sites are adjacent to minority communities, that we would be extremely concerned about that. But EPA's budget is a drop in the federal budget bucket. I'm sure EPA could identify additional efficiencies and trim the budget along the margins, but overall, EPA is trying to accomplish big goals with limited funds, protecting America's water supply and air quality, taking action on climate change, and protecting all Americans from dangerous toxic chemicals. So we shouldn't be fooled by Republican rhetoric about the budget here. This is the most anti-environmental Congress in history, any way you look at it. It shows that in their efforts to pass legislation that would weaken the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and it shows in the massive and damaging budget cuts that they have proposed to the EPA. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a little personal experience in the state of Nebraska regarding the state revolving fund. For example, a battle that we had with some of the EPA folks in rural Nebraska just a few years ago were on copper pipes. And what happens is the groundwater is a little higher acidic. And so when it sits in the pipe, it draws out some of the copper. The mandate from the EPA was to put in a water treatment facility. It would have been a fraction of the cost for some of these small towns to just go out and rip out on city dollar or little town dollars all copper pipes and replace them. But those weren't options. We put those on the table and they were rejected by the EPA. So sometimes a water treatment facility is the least efficient, most expensive, but yet the one that was mandated. Those are the type of lack of common sense, overzealousness that we're looking at here. So perhaps, at least from Nebraska, the revolving fund for the drinking water is not exactly the example to use to show how mean and anti-environmental the Republicans are. Now, reading through these reports, especially GAO, it talks about in many areas where there's redundancies, divided responsibilities, and what we're trying to figure out is there a way to make the EPA leaner. So when you, Ms. Bennett, Honorable Bennett, mentioned that there were worthy projects that have been cut. You mentioned drinking water along the U.S.-Mexican border. Mr. Trimble also mentioned drinking water project along the Mexican border, which they felt was inefficient. Is that the same one that you said was cut?
It is the same program, I believe, if I
Okay.
think it's the same program, because I'm only aware of one.
Well,
And
that, probably should put it in full context that that was also one that was declared by GAO as one that was inefficient. Could you do the subcommittee here a favor as we're trying to make you a leaner, more efficient agency to accomplish your legislative goals or goals that Congress has set out for you? Could you provide us an itemization of all projects that have been cut or eliminated in the last 2 fiscal years?
in the,
Could you provide that? That's a yes.
well,
or no.
in the budgets that we have submitted to Congress, there is a list
Okay,
of terminations that already exist.
all right. Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out is, you gave me an example of 2 that were cut. As I understand from this whisper in my ear, that the budget gives us the proposed ones. I'm looking backwards to see which ones were actually cut or eliminated. Could you provide ones that were actually in the last 2 fiscal years cut or eliminated?
I'll be happy to get back to you on that.
Thank you very much. Now, in the very bland, we get it. This is just a balance sheet. And because it's so bland, it lacks a lot of data. Of course, the data's in a 6-inch spiral notebook. But on the unexpended appropriations / other funds, note 17, can you itemize for us what programs where they have the leftover or unspent funds?
The unliquidated obligations, yeah, what we established.
Rose, tomato, yeah.
Well, the reason I state that is because there's a difference between unobligated funds and unliquidated obligations, and I just want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing, and this line reflects the unliquidated obligations or the unspent funds that have been obligated. This year, my office instituted a tool for the agency to be able to...
Yeah, my time is up, so could you provide a list of those
of the
unliquidated, which we call unexpended, and also the next line, cumulative results of operation earmark funds? I'm kind of curious about that. Could you give us a list of the earmarks of which there are unspent, unliquidated funds?
We'll be happy to get back to you.
Thank you. That's the perfect answer.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent that Ms. Bennett be able to finish the answer she was trying to give about the tool.
Sure,
for
go ahead.
Can the gentlelady yield for me? I wasn't trying to be rude. I had no time left and just
No, go
wanted to
ahead.
get on it.
Ms. Bennett, go ahead and answer the question.
Well, I think it's important to note that the unliquidated obligations has been not only mentioned by the Inspector General and GAO, but I know that I when I came on board, wanted to tackle it myself. So my office this year, I know I've put a real renewed focus on looking at unliquidated obligations. We instituted a new tool and provided new guidance to the agency so that every unliquidated obligation was reviewed on at least an annual basis, and they have to send assurances to me that they have done so. And by virtue of that tool, we've been able to reduce the unliquidated obligations by over 50% in 1 year alone. So we recognize that this is an issue. We recognize this is an important budget item, and it's important for me as CFO to make sure that funds are not only used properly, but they're expended in the most efficient and effective way.
All right. Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much. I'm very concerned that a lot of these cuts are going to harm jobs and the ability of communities across the country to improve the environmental conditions. And it's interesting that we just had this conversation on the unliquidated obligations. The mayor of Tampa on October 6th received a letter from the EPA, from Stanley Meidberg, the Deputy Regional Administrator, that says, "We regret to inform you that the U.S. EPA will not be able to award the City of Tampa $1.25 million for the project regarding sediment removal from estuaries of the headwaters of the canals that are at issue." This is a matter that the city, the residents, the EPA, and the state has been working on for years. It's a grant the city received some years ago. Sometimes these initiatives do take time. There are some issues here with state permits. I don't understand how the EPA, understanding all of the actions that have gone on and an issue like this, all of the reliance on the grant funds, the monies expended. I mean, we've got an engineering firm that has already expended about $600,000. We have another contractor that has expended about $22,000, and EPA says that they're not going to live up to their end of the bargain. They're on the hook, or the deal was that they would pay 55% of this clean water initiative, and the City of Tampa would pay 45%. This has been an understanding for many years. Will you explain to me how this could happen, how the EPA could just, after all the years of work on this, how the EPA could renege on the deal and take back the money that we've relied on?
Ms. Castor, that is a very good example of very worthy projects that that end up having to be cut. In the 2011 budget that we received from the appropriations, we were directed by Congress to rescind $140 million of unobligated funds in a particular account, and that particular account was the state and tribal assistant grants. We did not have a choice as to which appropriation account, and that we were also further directed that it must come from unobligated funds. So we attempted to try to be as very fair as possible, recognizing that there are so many good projects on those lists. But we went back and went to the oldest unobligated funds that we had in that category, and came up with the $140 million of unobligated funds that were 2008 or earlier, and it sounds like, I'm afraid, that particular one was one of them.
But we've relied on it. The city has expended money. People have been hired. They're ready to begin the project next year. Doesn't EPA owe us at least the portion of the funds that have been expended to date? And I would argue all of it.
We were left with very little latitude in terms of how we had to take the cut to the budget.
So these jobs are just going to go away. See, now this is a real-world example of how when you do things irrationally, it really hurts jobs and it hurts the environmental quality of our community. We've been working on this for years and years and years, and it's just, it's unconscionable that these kind of cuts would have an impact on jobs and the environmental quality in my community. And I'm going to leave these materials with you and want to talk to you all at greater length about at least covering the portion of the monies that have been expended to date. Explain that discrepancy. How come EPA doesn't recognize that, okay, to date we've spent over $600,000 on this, and at least that portion should be covered?
Again, I had very little latitude in terms of how we were to cover the cut. We looked at the funds that had not been obligated. These were unobligated earmarks from many years ago, and so we tried to apply them as fairly as possible, recognizing that when you cut funds, real projects get hurt. And
real projects, real jobs,
that.
the expectations of a community that for many years.
Yes, there was $140 million rescission across that had to be taken, and it was taken across the country. And I appreciate your concern on that.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Bennett, let me just ask you a question. And I appreciate these problems that we're talking about at the EPA are longstanding and long in their generation. And your tenure there began when?
The end of 2009, so I'm coming up on 2 years.
Okay. You have my deepest sympathy. But you were a CFO in the real world at one time, is that not correct?
Indeed, I was.
So, and I appreciate the problem that the representative from Florida just articulated. That's very difficult at home. But on the other hand, as a CFO, I mean, you understand when you see the net position, unexpended appropriations, $13.5 billion in an agency that has an $8 billion a year budget. I mean, that's 1.5 times your annual budget. I mean, that becomes an attractive target, especially in a time when budget cuts are happening all over the place. So you see the problem there as a you know, with your CFO eyes, you see that problem, correct?
And that's why I put a real renewed focus on it this year. My staff will tell you that it's about what I talk about an awful lot in terms of making sure that the funds are used effectively and efficiently and most expeditiously.
Well, and I would just second Mr. Terry's request that we get the details of that and the details of the next line, the earmarked funds, because I think that's going to be very important in helping us foster an understanding of just what is going on here. Mr. Barton's request that the credit card statements be reviewed, I think, is rational. If someone's buying automobiles, we at least want to make sure they're buying hybrids, not Mustangs, because we all know the EPA rating for a Mustang on miles per gallon is pretty high. You know, on the GAO report, and again, I'm asking you to look at this with your CFO eyes. Here I'm looking at the management of EPA's workload, workforce, and real property, and the paragraph begins, with respect to workload and workforce, EPA has struggled for years to identify its human resource needs and deploy the staff throughout the agency in a manner that would do the most good. Okay, fair enough. You've only been there for 2 years. This is a problem that's longstanding. But I mean, this is the stuff that really gets you. EPA requested funding and staffing through incremental adjustments based largely on historical precedent. That means our budget was X last year for this, and it's going to be X plus for this year. And instead of going back and evaluating what you really need to do the job to do the most good for the most people, you simply take what happened last time and add to it. Is that what's going on here? Is that what the GAO is referencing?
The approach that I take to the budget process is not on an incremental basis. The direction that we give is to look at the programs and to use subject matter experts to determine the level of funding. That said, I also recognize that the reports that GAO has come forward with the workload, and that it's been a long time in coming. I will tell you that when I asked about the reports and what they referenced, what I was trying to balance was a prior report on workload had indicated that we might need as many as 3,000 additional people. And I didn't feel that that was going to be an effective way.
No, it was not.
And
And I'm going to interrupt you only because of the interest of time. But the problem is the reports we have in front of us, the Inspector General's report, the GAO report, I mean, the same theme repeats itself over and over again. In the IG report, the comments about the information technology, that it's taken a long time and a lot of extra money to get that right, and no one even knows how many workstations and how many computers. You're a CFO. I mean, that's pretty basic. I mean, I'm just a simple country doctor, but that seems to me to be CFO 101 stuff. Is that a correct interpretation?
it is definitely something that a CFO, including myself, takes very seriously, and why I'm working with both the Inspector General and GAO to make sure that we're addressing those recommendations.
In the last Congress, when we heard from the Office of Water, and the IG's report at that time brought up that the Office of Water had more unimplemented recommendations by the IG's office than any other branch, and I looked at the result as of March 31st, 2011, and it's the same thing. The Office of Water stands out as having more unimplemented obligations. Let me just ask you this. Lisa Jackson, Administrator Jackson, last summer convened a group of folks and said, we got to get ready for the budget cuts. Is that correct? I have a news report here somewhere that references that from, I think, July 19th.
We were preparing to go through the budget process.
Can you get us a list of the programs that were identified as most essential from that meeting? Did the meeting take place? I assume it did.
We had a discussion at the meeting.
Did you generate a list of the programs that were most essential or least essential?
We provide a lot of analysis during that time in terms of how we go about in making decisions in terms of, pre-decisional type of.
Would you be willing to share with this committee the results of that meeting?
Well, pre-decisional meetings, pre-decisional materials are typically not provided.
But you had a meeting, and were there no action items then coming out of this meeting?
The
last
action
July?
items, the action items that are in reference to the meeting in July and conversations since then were for the presentation of the 2013 budget, which is still not complete.
Well, I think this committee probably does have the ability to see the pre-decisional material, the right to see the pre-decisional material, and I would ask you when you go back to see if you cannot make that information available to the committee, because just like you, and we're faced with tough choices too. The water quality things on the Texas-Mexico border. I mean, that's far away from my district, but I've visited the Colonias. I know the problem that they have. And if the problem was that you guys didn't study what you actually needed before you started pumping money in, and now you feel that it's being wasted, that's a huge problem. We need to get to the bottom of it. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Thank you.
I would ask that the pre-decisional materials be made available to the committee and committee staff, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our panel for being here today, and if you don't mind, let me go over. I know what y'all have to do on the executive branch budgeting, but we also have some responsibilities on our congressional budgeting process that I think needs to be concerned. In fact, I served many years in the legislature, and our governor sent us a budget, but we immediately threw it in the trash can and drew our own, which is typically what Congress will do. If you like the president's budget, to talk about it. If you don't, you go ahead and draft your own. The focus today is on the budgeting with the executive branch, but Congress plays a role. In fact, as Democrats on the subcommittee and bipartisan witnesses made clear at last week's hearing, the Constitution vests primary responsibility in Congress in carrying out that constitutional duty and responding to requirements of Budget Act. Once the President submits his budget to Congress in February, we're supposed to hold hearings on it. Authorizing committees are supposed to pass their views and estimates and send them to the budget committees, and then budget committees are supposed to produce a budget resolution. Once we have a budget resolution, Appropriations Committee should begin work on appropriation bills. Authorizing Committee begin work on reconciliation instructions contained in the budget resolution. Before the fiscal year begins on October 1st, 12 separate appropriations bills are supposed to be considered, debated, and passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the President. But that has not happened. I'm trying to think of how many years it has been since we've had it happen. To the contrary, over the last year, Congress has funded the government through a series of continuing resolutions, most recently one that lasted only a few days. And I can't imagine that this approach to budgeting enhances the efficiency of our federal government. Ms. Bennett, what impact do these short-term continuing resolutions have on your agency's ability to carry out its mission, whether it be contracting, grant writing, hiring, delay in projects, or particularly in cleaning up the environment?
Short-term CRs make it very difficult to implement programs, especially when they're multiple and very short in nature. It makes it very difficult to decide what to do because you're not sure how much money you're going to have. And I know certainly from my experience from the private sector, it would make it very difficult to operate a business.
Well, it seems like, I mean, EPA is a smaller agency compared to our other one, and even DOD. Twice in the last 6 months, our majority in the House has brought the government to a brink of a shutdown, once threatening to default on the nation's loan obligations. What impact do these shutdown threats have on efficient and effective agency operations?
Well, certainly when the workforce is looking at a possible shutdown, a lot of work is just put on hold to determine what we can do. because
If you'll
we
be
have-
there the next day in some cases.
Exactly, and a very anxious workforce, as well as trying to determine what we are actually legally able to do in terms of a shutdown.
When, in your agency, would your agency be better able to act efficiently and effectively if Congress fulfilled its statutory duties under the Budget Act and passed not only all of the appropriations, but maybe just a few on time?
It would certainly, to have a budget that's approved on time would certainly be helpful.
Well, and I know a lot of us came out of the business sector and it is amazing how we couldn't run a small business where I was at, not knowing what we may be able to do. Congress certainly has an oversight to play with respect to the federal budget, but it also has a constitutional duty to respond to the President's budget proposals in good faith and ensure that the budget emerges from Congress in a manner that promotes administrative efficiency and programmatic effectiveness. I think maybe Congress ought to be looking at our responsibility on doing that, whether it's this committee or any other committee, particularly the Appropriations and Budget Committee. And with Mr. Chairman, I'll be glad to yield my time to our ranking member if she has any other questions. No?
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I noted with some interest that you indicated, Ms. Bennett, that the $13 billion in unexpended appropriations, I think your words were maybe more than 5 years in implementation, that some of these commitments may have been made more than 5 years ago. And I'm curious about that because I guess what I'm hearing is, and I need you to tell me if I'm incorrect, is that sometimes to get complicated projects done and to do things in the right way and to make sure that you're doing them in the most efficient way possible, it takes more than 5 years to get some of these projects done. Would that be an accurate statement?
Well, I think that many projects can take more than a few years.
Uh-huh. And so I guess what I'm trying to figure out, and I know it's not really your role, so I'll make it more of a rhetorical question, is why would the EPA oppose H.R. 2250, which would give businesses 5 years in order to comply with new regulations from the EPA? I leave that as a rhetorical question, but I do note it with some interest that the EPA is not able to follow the rules that they oppose for businesses. And I would then point out to you that I also have heard a lot of talk about wastewater and safe drinking water programs and so forth, and that a lot of those may be in here. And I will tell you of an incident, because this may be part of the problem that has been brought to my attention recently, where without having the cooperation that we heard is not going on, various agencies of the state and federal, including the EPA, came up with different rules, and some areas were trying to work on these very issues, safe water and safe drinking water and wastewater, and the big impediment to getting them done in a timely fashion, and what ended up costing them more money, were not having the flexibility, like Mr. Terry pointed out, not the exact same situation, but not having flexibility from the EPA and others, and different people coming in and telling folks different things, and so they had the construction crews there ready to go, and then all of a sudden somebody comes in and says, wait a minute, you haven't done X, and not looking at practical solutions to the problem and just said, nope, you've got to follow this strict rule. That project was then delayed and cost the community additional monies, and it may very well be one of your 13 billion programs, because they're trying hard to both bring safe drinking water and wastewater programs into my district, but also to comply with the regulations put on them trying to get those projects completed by the EPA. And so I would ask that you do work very hard to make sure that you get that cooperation going, because when you don't have the cooperation and folks actually have let the contracts and have the bulldozers sitting there, that equipment costs money to have sitting there while they try then to comply with something new that was thrown at them at the last minute. So I encourage you to encourage the EPA to do that. I also would have to ask, in regard to figuring out the staffing, and I guess I'm going to switch to Mr. Elkins, would I be correct that when you're saying that you need to know what kind of staffing needs you have, and that there hadn't been a study and you really need to have a study, be akin to trying to run a McDonald's and not know when your peak periods were for that particular community and neighborhood, and how many employees you needed to have, and so then maybe you overstaff all the time to make sure you can meet the peak demands? If you don't have the accurate information on how many people it takes to get lunch served in that particular community, isn't it true you're liable to have more employees than you need in order to meet the peak periods?
That would be a fair conclusion, yes.
And is that the same kind of situation? Not that EPA is trying to meet the lunch crowd, but the similar type of thing, that they may not have the right number of people in the right locations, and they may actually be overstaffing?
That's a fair conclusion, yes.
All right, thank you very much. And in regard to the rent, is it possible that EPA could look for cheaper accommodations? I've noticed they have some of the nicest buildings as I come into Washington every week. Is it possible they could move to cheaper accommodations?
Well, I would assume anything is possible.
All right. If I indicated to you that we have lots of empty space in the 9th Congressional District of Virginia, and that's actually close to an area that the EPA seems to be focused a lot of attention on, the coal mining region of the Central Appalachians, it would seem to make sense, and we may not want them close, but they might actually understand some of the issues better. If I told you the rent down there is a whole lot cheaper in Washington, they could save some money that way, couldn't they?
Well, you know, that may be a little bit.
It would have to be studied, I assume.
Yes.
In regard to the 37 labs, I heard something that I don't understand, and there was 37 labs, but it was like 115 buildings. Can you explain that to me?
Yeah, 37 labs, but they have about 170 buildings or facilities. So some of those may be not full office buildings or lab facilities, but smaller operations as well. So it's about 170 located in 30 cities, all operating under 15 different managers.
And I think the conclusion that you have made, that I think most people would make, is that there ought to be some room for consolidation. You might not need 15, but you might need 7 or 8 managers and fewer buildings.
I think we're agnostic on whether you need consolidation as much as it is you need the information to know whether you have the right number and in the right places and the right skill sets. And if you're doing workforce planning, you need to manage your entire portfolio as an integrated portfolio as opposed to sort of stovepiped.
All right. I appreciate that. And I see that my time's up, and I yield back my time.
Gentlemen, yield back his time. Mr. Scalise is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the panelists coming to talk about the budget. I know one of my colleagues on the other side was lamenting the failure to pass a budget, and I would share that concern. I know not 3 months after this Republican majority came into Congress, we passed a budget over the Senate. It's been nearly 3 years since the Senate's passed a budget of any kind. They took up our budget, voted it down. They took up the president's budget and didn't even get one vote. Not one vote in the United States Senate for the president's budget. So, you know, hopefully our friends over in the Senate will finally start doing their job that we've already done over here. If they don't like our budget, pass one of their own that they can pass. But it's been almost 3 years, so I would imagine y'all must have some frustrations with that as well. When we're talking about, you know, you've mentioned cuts. When I look at your budget, when President Obama took office, it was around $7.5 billion. Is that correct? Is that a ballpark?
In 2009, it was $7.6 billion.
And today, what is your budget on an annualized?
In 2011, it was just under 8.7.
So your budget's actually gone up over $1 billion. How is that a cut?
From 2009, it was not a cut.
So you had a $7.5 billion budget 2 years ago. Every state, I know in my state, pretty much every state that I've been following, they're actually cutting the size of their budget. You talk to families who are struggling in these tough times. Most families have been cutting back over the last 2 years, and yet you've had over $1 billion increase in your budget over the last 2 years, and you're complaining that you're cut somehow? I mean, maybe in Washington that's a cut, but when you look at your budget 2 years ago, you look at what states have dealt with, what families have dealt with, you've actually got more than $1 billion increase over that time, and you're somehow calling that a cut that's hurting health?
Actually, in terms of the overall budget from 2000 to 2009, there was no increase in the EPA's budget from those 2 years.
Well, we're looking at the 2.5 years going back to when President Obama took office.
And in 2010, there was a large increase in 2 particular areas in particular.
Well, and I hope you'd understand that you know, we're living in the real world, and you know, you talk to families when we go back home and meet with our small business owners. They're cutting back. They want to reinvest in their business and create jobs. And frankly, EPA has been the main source of job losses when you talk to a lot of our small businesses. They say it's the things that y'all are doing, some of these new regulations that are coming out that are making it impossible for them to create jobs in the real world. And I hope you'd understand that it's kind of hard for a lot of those businesses and families that are struggling, and they're cutting back. They want to create jobs, but they can't because of some of the rules you're sending out. You've actually had an increase of $1 billion compared to 2 years ago, and you're trying to complain to us that you got to cut. And so I just want to put that on the record, because clearly, you go from 7.5 billion 2 years ago to over 8.5 billion today. That's not a cut. I mean, are those numbers correct?
The increase of SRFs and to the Great Lakes are, for the most part, straight pass-throughs to the state and to the communities.
Yeah, and so, again, like I said, a lot of people struggling out there. They'd be more than happy to have that kind of increase, more than a 10% increase over a 2-year period. When we look at some of the things that are in this report, when you go to the properties, in your testimony, let's see right here, Ms. Bennett, your testimony on page 3, you'd said that y'all have released approximately 375,000 square feet of facilities, resulting in cumulative annual rent avoidance of over $12.5 million. By rent avoidance, you mean
We're not incurring it.
you reduced the amount of space, but then when I look at the Inspector General's report, it says you're spending probably somewhere around $300 million a year, and in some cases, you've got buildings where you have 1 or 2 EPA employees for that whole building. Have you seen that in the Inspector General's report?
I have. We do have a number of facilities. We have not only a number of office facilities, we have, as Mr. Trimble has mentioned, we have a number of labs and we have a number of warehouses. The field offices that have 1 or 2 people, I have recently directed that we have a review of all offices that have less than 10 people in order to make sure that we continue to need them, and with the new technology that's available, that perhaps we have more.
Okay, and you go on to say you plan to further reduce energy utilization. Maybe you can get some of those extra Cylindra solar panels to put on the roof, and maybe we could get something to show for that $535 million we might be on the hook for. Going to the audited report, the EPA audited report, and I know I'm running low on time, so I'm going to just ask these quick questions and see if you can give me the details. On page 33, unpaid obligations looks like $13.8 billion. If you can get me a breakdown, or get the committee a breakdown of what that really means, because we don't have anything beyond just one line that says unpaid obligations, $13.8 billion, undelivered orders, $12.8 billion, if you can get the committee a breakdown of that. And finally, unexpired, on page 71, unexpired, unobligated balance, $4.4 billion. If you could get the committee details about what that really is, because it doesn't give that to us in this audit. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you as well for the witnesses, their time to join us today. And so just to follow up on Mr. Scalise's questions, the EPA funding has increased then over the last 2 years?
Since 2009, it has increased.
It has increased. Okay, thank you for that. And you had mentioned earlier there's about 17,200 employees at the EPA, or at least that was in the request.
We've requested in 2012.
What percentage or what number of those are actually involved in writing regulations?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure, but I'm happy to get back to you.
Yeah, if you could get back to me and let us know how many of those are involved in writing regulations, I would appreciate it. And do you anticipate a budget being passed by the Senate this year? And if so, what would that number be?
I don't think I'll answer that one.
Okay. Is that because you don't think they'll pass one?
No, because I think that's not my decision.
Okay. And if you could ballpark the number of mandates that are coming out of the EPA on various drinking water regulations, on various municipal treatment, sewage treatment regulations, regulations that are going out to the out to local municipalities when it comes to drinking water treatment and sewer treatment. Do you have an idea of the unfunded mandate, the level of unfunded mandates right now?
My responsibility as CFO is to ensure the financial integrity of the EPA's budget. And so protecting public health.
You're not involved in those? Okay.
I'm not involved in that.
Then going back to that question of this $13.3 billion that has been discussed at length today, that is not in the budget justification submitted to Congress. Is that correct?
No, and that's a figure that's a year old. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so what did that figure be today?
We're still closing the books. I don't have the number for you right now.
But surely you know what's been spent out of that as the year goes. I mean, you keep a running tally of how much money's being spent out of that.
I would have to get back to you on that off the top of my head. I don't know the figure, but we have looked at the unliquidated obligations, which is the same thing as the unexpended obligations, and have done and implemented a tool that allows for us to be able to review all of the unliquidated obligations and see what we might be able to deobligate and either recertify or return back.
And that's been implemented now?
That, my office implemented it this year in 2011.
But you still don't know how much of the 13.3 billion is left?
Off the top of my head, I do not.
Even though that tool has been implemented?
I don't have the tool in front of me at this particular moment.
Okay, so it's still something that you don't know about $13.3 billion, where it is or how it's being spent or how much is being left?
I would have to get back to you on that.
Mr. Trimble, does EPA have access to that $13.3 billion for other program use?
We have not looked at the balance sheet, so I really couldn't speak to that. I could probably come back to you with something, but I don't.
Ms. Bennett, where is that $13.3 billion today?
We've already agreed that we would get back to you on the information that in regards to that particular amount, but it reflects obligations that the agency has made and for projects that are ongoing, and so we would be happy to get back with you on any more details.
And Mr. Elkins, do you know where that money, can they use that money, have access to that $13.3 billion for other programs?
Let me defer to Melissa Heiss on that question.
It varies by appropriation. Some can be made available and some would have to be returned, so it depends.
And when you say returned, who is that returned to?
Well, the money hasn't actually been drawn down from the Treasury and sitting at EPA. So it would be available to be reappropriated, I guess.
Only if they're not valid obligations.
Exactly.
If they're not, so if they haven't been drawn down, and they would be, let's say there's some left over on a particular project, then they would be returned if there is still time left in terms of the amount of money, the amount of time that could be used. They could be recertified and redeployed. Otherwise, they would be returned to the Treasury.
And so, recertified and redeployed. By that, you're talking about a new program, reobligated for that initial, what it was initially offered for? And so there is no way then for EPA to use that for other purposes within EPA?
Some of it could be reused at EPA, and some of it would have
for different purposes than what they had originally.
Well, it would have to be used for the purpose for which it was appropriated.
Okay.
So if it was for water projects, it would have to be used for water.
But maybe on a different water project?
Yes. They could.
And you'll get that information back to us and where that money is and how it's.
We've agreed to follow up with you on.
And can you give us some kind of a guarantee that you'll put that into the budget justifications so that we have that information before, so we don't have to have a congressional hearing to find out what's happening with this money?
I'll be happy to get back to you on it.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
With that, if we'll just pause for a second, I'll have the real chairman resume his position. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia. Ms. Bennett, my colleague, Dr. Burgess, requested the pre-decisional materials resulting from the July meeting called by Administrator Jackson. Can you please confirm for the record that the EPA will provide these materials to the committee?
It's not my decision as to the provision of pre-decisional meetings, but I will be happy to confer with OMB and inside the agency. I certainly appreciate your interest in the issue and be happy to get back to you on it.
Mr. Trimble, does the EPA have access to funds that it does not report to Congress in its budget proposal?
Well, I think if this is in reference to monies that they have deobligated and have recertified for other programs, yes. So, for example, if they have a grant or a interagency agreement that has been closed and there's funds that have been left over, EPA during the course of the year can use those funds for other purposes within certain constraints.
How much money are we talking about? Has the amount of unexpended appropriations remained relatively constant?
I don't have a trend that I could give you. I know when we first started tracking this issue over 10 years ago, this was an area where the agency was not doing a good job. They've done much better recently. I believe the last year I remember looking at this, they had the number they had repurposed was about $160 million.
Considering the large amounts of unexpended obligation, it raises the question, why isn't the EPA spending the money provided by Congress?
Well, in the monies that we're talking about that we've looked at as part of our review of the budget justification requests, typically the monies we're talking about are for programs where they did spend some of the money, just not all the money. For example, a grant or an interagency agreement or a contract. They've carried out some of the work, or the contract was terminated earlier. It didn't cost as much, so there's money left over. So the contract's closed, and what our past work had shown is that they had not been doing a good job of monitoring that and sweeping those monies up to be used for other purposes. So over the years, GAO plus the IG have been pressing EPA on this. They've improved their tracking. What we've recommended or suggested is that when they've repurposed this money, it be transparent to the Hill so that you can consider that in your budget deliberations.
If the EPA is not spending the money, even you mentioned that they might cancel a contract and they have leftover funds.
Well, there could be that the reason they have the leftover money was the contract was canceled. So, for example, a project is terminated or it's finished early, so they thought it was going to cost $10 million, it costs $5 million. They complete the contract. You still have the money that was obligated, but they never spent it.
So what happens to that $5 million?
Well, it sits unless they flag it and then deobligate it and then put it to another purpose. And those were the issues that we've been flagging over the past 10 years.
Could they use that for next year's budget?
I think depending, I would defer to EPA on this, but I think you could, depending on, some money's no-year money, some money may have a time limit on it.
Mr. Trimble, is it correct that GAO issued a report just this past July that identified challenges relating to EPA's management of its real property, namely property management, identifying excess and underused property as an area where they may be budget savings for our Subcommittee?
I'm not familiar with the work we've done for the Subcommittee, but I believe that's
I mean, just in general.
Yeah, I believe
you're
that's an area
stating there's areas where there's underused property that we could save money. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I believe, and that's an area of high risk that we've identified for a long time for the federal government.
Isn't it also true that GAO found that the EPA did not have accurate and reliable information on the need of its facilities, property use, facility conditions, and operating efficiencies?
Yes, specifically that's in relation to its laboratory facilities.
Ms. Bennett, do you agree with what Mr. Trimble indicated, that the GAO findings concerning the completeness and reliability of operating costs and other data needed to manage EPA properties not there?
We certainly respect the findings of the GAO, and we're working towards addressing the issues and being able to improve on those issues.
Mr. Trimble, you reference in your, let's see here, June 2010 presidential memorandum that directed agencies to accelerate efforts to identify and eliminate excess properties to help achieve $3 billion in cost saving by 2012. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Did EPA eliminate any of its laboratories or major assets as a result of that directive?
No, EPA told OMB that they needed all their lab facilities.
Let me see if I understand this. EPA tells the White House it doesn't have excess property, but GAO's own work, and EPA concurs, shows the agency doesn't have accurate or reliable information to make this determination. Is that an accurate statement, Mr. Trimble?
Well, I don't know about the EPA concurring. At the time, the key factors that they needed to factor into the decision concern need, usage, efficiency, cost. Those were all the things called for by OMB for the analysis, and our review found that EPA's data in those areas was either incomplete or the accuracy was questionable.
Ms. Bennett, so the question for you is, how can EPA justify its response to the White House that it doesn't have duplicative or excess property when it doesn't have the data to support their determination?
Well, in terms of the labs for 2012, we have included in our president's budget request some funds in order to make sure that we properly look at the use and the skills that are necessary for the labs to see where we might be able to have additional efficiencies and where we might be able to save costs.
You see what I'm saying, though? I mean, your EPA is making this decision, and yet it's clear you don't even have the reliable information to make this decision, yet you're telling them. What's what Mr.
And we're working on getting better information for to make the decisions that are necessary.
How long is that going to take you?
The lab study that we hope to be undertaking pending appropriation would be done in 2012.
Okay, my time.
Mr. Trimble, I completely agree with the recommendation that that for unexpended appropriations, which aren't actually going to go to a project, and they're repurposed by the agency, that needs to be transparent. And I'm assuming, Ms. Bennett, you would agree with that as well.
Indeed.
And just so we can be clear for the record, Mr. Trimble, Ms. Bennett told us a little while ago that of this unexpended appropriation line, some of that is for projects that are coming down the pike. GAO doesn't object to any of that, right?
Yeah, I'm not an accountant, so full disclosure here.
Me neither.
The numbers that GAO has been talking about are not the unexpended appropriations on this balance sheet.
Okay.
I believe my understanding, and limited as it is that the balance sheet numbers may include, there may be obligations behind those numbers, so it's just a matter of a timing issue in the spending. That's
right.
That's
And the other thing is, for some of the appropriations, they might be appropriations that couldn't be redirected depending on how broad or narrow they are, right?
Yeah, and again, I would defer.
You know, if it's an, I'll ask Ms. Bennett, if it's an appropriation for like water projects and you didn't need it for this one, but for that one, you could repurpose that, right?
If it was within the same appropriation.
Right. But sometimes, but that's what we should know if you're doing that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And then you might have an appropriation though for something else. You might not have, may not be able to repurpose that because of the nature of the appropriation. That would revert to the Treasury, right?
If we cannot recertify, if we cannot find another project of a suitable nature,
right,
then it would, as my understanding is, it would go back to the Treasury.
Right. And does that happen?
It does.
Okay. I think that's part of what the chairman is wanting to know, how much that happens. But just to be clear, this money that's on this balance sheet, or any other money it looks like a lot of money sitting there, $13 billion or $14 billion, but that's not actually just a whole bunch of cash sitting around that could be used to offset against next year's EPA appropriation. Much of that money is obligated, correct?
That money is obligated, so the government has an obligation to meet its contracts. Yeah.
And when we just cut those funds of previously obligated money, what Congresswoman Castor was talking about, that's exactly the kind of thing that happens, is projects have to be eliminated, even sometimes projects that are underway, right?
Well, in her case, it was for projects that had not actually been obligated.
Oh, okay.
So those were those particular funds. So a contract had not been entered into.
I see.
A grant had not been entered into her case. However, it still affected real work and real jobs, according to what
They were counting on that money, even though it wasn't obligated, and then it got cut, right?
It was a very, very difficult decision.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank all of these witnesses for coming. I think this is a really useful review. And as I mentioned in my, as I mentioned in a sidebar to you, Mr. Chairman, I think once the EPA completes this analysis of what they're going to do based on the IG's recommendations, that we should have a follow-up hearing, I think would be useful. Yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Griffin from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The EPA has various initiatives like the American Great Outdoors Initiative, Green Power Partnership, the Ag Star Program, and the Energy Star, just to name a few. I was wondering if you can tell me, do you know how many voluntary programs there are at the EPA?
I know we have quite a few voluntary programs. The exact number, I'd have to follow back up with you on that.
And do you have any idea how much the agency spends on the voluntary programs versus statutorily required programs?
Most of the funds go to statutorily required programs, but I don't know the exact split.
All right. If you could get me the answers to both of those questions later, that would be greatly appreciated. Can you do that for us?
I believe I can. I'll certainly follow up with you on it.
All right. And in its 2012 request, EPA proposed a $36 million reduction from non-point source pollution grants. However, at the same time, it proposed increases in other programs with a focus on non-point pollution, Mississippi River Basin Initiative, Chesapeake Bay Program, etc. After review, it appears the EPA may be proposing to just move money from one account to another. Are these cuts real cuts, or is the EPA simply shifting the money from one of its programs to another?
Well, I think you're referring to what we call the categorical grants in the STAG account. And indeed, the non-point source did sustain we were proposing a $36 million cut. We had every part of our budget process is consultation with the states, with ECOS, and with the tribes. And based on that consultation, although the 319 program is a very important one, we also recognize that there were other categorical grants that they had indicated might be more important to them. And so we were trying to accommodate those requests.
Now, as a part of that cooperation that we heard about today from other witnesses, is it possible, do you think, that because it looks like the USDA is doing the same work on non-point source that you all are doing, is there some way y'all could get together and perhaps reduce the cost of working on the problem? Not saying you shouldn't work on the problem, but reduce the cost of working on the problem by not duplicating that particular information, and have you all talk to the USDA about what they're doing so you can coordinate?
That was actually a factor in when we were making the decision in terms of how we would make trade-offs within those categorical grants, working closely with USDA and seeing if we might be able to leverage our collective resources better.
All right.
Sir, if I may, just to note, we
Yes,
we have an ongoing review of the 319 program, and part of the scope of the review is to look at coordination with USDA.
Okay. Let me ask you, is that in regard to this cooperation with the states, is that a real cooperation? Can any of you all answer that question for me? Because I just left the state legislature about a year ago, and it didn't feel much like cooperation when representatives of the EPA came down and told us what we were going to do, and that we couldn't look for, as Mr. Terry said earlier, and as I pointed out earlier, we couldn't look for more cost-effective ways to try to achieve the same purpose. We were going to have to follow one of two models that the EPA approved. Can anybody answer whether or not there's actual cooperation with the states, or is it just being dictated to? Because that's the way I felt in Virginia.
Well, I couldn't answer that broadly. I think in the 319 program, part of the review will look at its implementation and its structure throughout the state, so it may indirectly get at your question.
All right.
Mr. Griffiths,
Yes, ma'am.
strengthening the partnerships and the relationship with the states and the tribes is one of the administrator's 7 priorities and one of our aspects in our strategic plan, one of the cross-cutting fundamental strategies that we have. So we're taking the relationship with the states very importantly. I know I've had several conversations with the state leadership and ECOS, in particular on these unliquidated obligations and how we can move the money faster. So I know as the CFO, I'm trying to take it very seriously, and as the agency, it's a very high priority.
All right. I appreciate that very much. Appreciate you all's time today. It's been very helpful. I appreciate the chairman having this hearing because I'm learning lots, and I'm new, and there's a lot of these things I haven't heard before, so I do appreciate it and yield back my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. Gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had a couple of follow-up questions on the Title 42 provisions. Now, Mr. Inspector General, have you studied the Title 42 provisions and the number of positions that the EPA is now employing under Title 42 guidelines?
No, we have not looked at those.
Well, and, you know, Mr. Barton referenced that one of the unions was concerned. It's the National Treasury Employees Union. In fact, the data I have was supplied to them under a Freedom of Information Act request. It's not directly from the EPA, though it was the EPA's response to the Freedom of Information Act request filed by the National Treasury's Employee Union. But the, well, just for an example, on the, Ms. Bennett, you may not be able to tell us, but the starting salary or the salary that would be required to hire someone with a title of research microbiologist, what would the typical salary range for that be?
I'm not able to say that. I do know that in any Title 42 hiring, a very rigorous process is undergone to ensure that those individuals are are pertinent for that kind of a salary, if it's over and above the regular GS or SES schedule.
Did you try to, I mean, we're in a recession and everyone talks about nobody can find a job. Did you try to fill it with someone with, who might be able to accept the normal GS scale for that position? Was it necessary to go to a Title 42?
Yeah, as you suggested, I'm not familiar with each individual one, but typically, as I understand, the Title 42s are used when other avenues have been exhausted and they can't be hired.
Well, and I just, you know, again, I'm having difficulty believing in this environment where all the time we hear where people cannot find jobs, people are looking and they can't find them. I find it hard to believe that the position couldn't even be filled with an American citizen. I mean, that's troubling.
I'm not familiar.
Well, I will provide you some of this information, and I would like your feedback on that because I've been trying to get information on this program for quite some time. I recognize that it's occasionally necessary to go out and get someone with particular expertise, but you know, since your tenure started, it's been what, 7 people that you've hired under Title 42 provisions, essentially doubling the number, almost doubling the number of hires under that provision from previous years. So again, in the worst recession the country's ever known, I would just ask the question, can we not find anyone suitably qualified who doesn't require the additional payment under Title 42 provisions? And I will get you that information. I would appreciate your attention to that. One other thing has come up. Are there dollars that the EPA is spending in grants that are delivered to concerns overseas?
There's been a long-standing practice in the agency and in the administration and several administrations to provide grants to some foreign entities.
But in this budgetary environment, does it make sense that we provide millions of dollars in grants to the Chinese government? I mean, they can certainly afford their own research, supporting projects related to coal mine methane utilization. I mean, it seems like that's something they would want to do on their own, and they've got the cash to do it, right?
I won't speak to what the Chinese can and can't do. However, I do know that in terms of a long-standing practice that this is that foreign entities have received grants.
How is that?
Transboundary issues, and as well as to help deliver and build capacity in order to have a more level playing field for U.S. products and services.
Yeah, still, though, it's a stretch to think that is helping our constituents directly. The EPA providing $150,000 to the International Criminal Police Organization in Lyon, France, to promote and strengthen international environment enforcement through capacity building. We're supposed to be helping them enforce their cap and trade law? Is that what we're doing?
I'm not familiar with the individual grants.
Well, how about the taxpayer benefit from the EPA's hundreds of thousands of dollars of funding Breathe Easy Jakarta, a partnership with the government of Jakarta to improve air quality management?
Again, I'm not familiar with individual grants.
Sure, and we'll provide you the direct things that we're concerned about. We would like responses to these because, again, these are questions that we get. You know, I go home and have a town hall, and 300 or 400 people show up, and someone sees one of these stories. These are the questions they ask. How can you justify spending? Wouldn't we be better to make that investment in our air quality here at home as opposed to Jakarta, Indonesia?
It's been a long-standing practice of many administrations to do this kind of.
Well, you're the
I understand.
you're the CFO, and your recommendation to your administrator may be that it's time to concentrate what monies we can spend. It's time to concentrate them here at home and not breathe easy Jakarta. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back, and I think we've completed our second round. Before I close, I just want to make a comment. Ms. Bennett, my understanding is that you've testified that with respect to the excess lab issue, the EPA is requesting more money in the President's budget to study issues concerning the EPA's labs. Is that correct?
In terms of the, how we should approach the labs, in terms of the usage and how we best structure them.
This is even though GAO has already performed an audit and issued recommendations to EPA already. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
So you're saying that the EPA needs to ask for more money in order to achieve savings from the GAO audit, in which they specifically outline ways that you could save money? So you're saying this morning you need more money to save money?
What we're trying to do is make sure that we keep in mind the science that's being done in each one of those labs, and that anywhere we might be able to consolidate, if that is an appropriate avenue, that we do so with the science.
So the EPA, though, has already issued recommendations, and they've been specific on how to save money, and they've done an audit. I would think lots of those you could implement. Couldn't you implement any of them?
There are some recommendations that we can implement, and that
You wouldn't need more money from the President's budget to do that. That's what you said.
The money that we're asking for in the 2012 budget would be a study that is done by and reviewed by the National Academy of Science to make sure that the science that is done in those labs continues to be of the caliber and is not impacted at all.
Seems to me that you could just run with the GAO's recommendation and do a lot of them and save money today, but you're not willing to commit to that. You just want to say you need more money to save money. So I'm a little puzzled. I ask unanimous consent that the committee's September 15, 2011 letter to EPA Administrator Jackson on line-by-line budget review, as well as EPA's October 11, 2011 letter response, be introduced into record. Without objection, the documents will be so entered. Yeah. Let's put this in. And also to put into the record the Environmental Protection Agency's consolidated balance sheet that we've talked about all morning. By unanimous consent, so ordered. I want to thank the witnesses for coming, for staying, and their testimony, and for the members staying for the second round. The committee rules provide that members have 10 days to submit additional questions for the record to the witness, and with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.